Welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. My name is David Hebert, and I'll be the instructor for this class. And so what I want to do today is go through the first lesson of the class, which can be found in Chapter 1 of the textbook of Mankiw's Macroeconomics book, and it goes through sort of the 10 basic principles of economics. And so let's go through these one at a time and sort of unpack them a little bit. So the first principle is that people face what are known as trade-offs. And so the idea here is that anytime you want to do anything, you must decide what you want to do, which entails giving up what you could have otherwise done. And so the common example that I like to give is that you can't spend all of your time partying in college and get a 4.0. You can't simultaneously take a vacation to Florida and go home for the weekend, right? You can't afford to eat out every single night and have one of those hoverboards that seem to be popular right now. And so people face trade-offs in everything that they do. They must make a decision about what it is that they want to do, right? You can't literally do everything simultaneously. The second principle, if I can get this going over, here we go. The second principle is that the cost of something is what you give up. Okay? So if you think about what this means, what this is saying is that every time you want to do something, you have to give something else up. You have to sacrifice what you could have done. So in the context of something that you're all facing, by coming to college, you all had to give up not only your tuition dollars, but you had to give up any alternative jobs that you may have had. And so the cost of coming to college is not just the dollars that you gave up, but all the things that you could have had. And so economists refer to those things as your opportunity cost. And this is a concept that we're going to be coming back to several times throughout the semester. Okay, your opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative for what you could be doing right now. So let's say that you're watching this video, and instead of watching this video, you could be, making dinner, right? And so what you're giving up by watching this video is making dinner. Okay, and so in the case of college, we would say that the opportunity cost of going to college is the value of whatever job or any other activity that you're giving up, that you can no longer do. Okay? When it comes to each individual class, we could say that the opportunity cost of coming to class, especially your early morning classes, the opportunity cost of attending class is the sleep that you could be giving up, or that you could be enjoying instead of being in the classroom. And so the opportunity cost of showing up in class is basically an extra hour of sleep. The third principle contains sort of two lessons in here. And the third principle is that rational people think at the margin. Okay? Now, there's two lessons in here. The first one is the concept of rationality, and then the second one is thinking at the margin. Okay, so let's go through these things real quickly, but we'll dive more deep into the rationality idea in the next lesson. So when economists talk about rationality, we typically only mean that what the person is doing is they're doing their best to accomplish their goals. So they have a goal in mind and they're trying their hardest. Okay? This doesn't mean that they're always right or that we don't make mistakes. It just means that we're never wrong on purpose. So think of the dartboard, for example. If you're playing darts or you're shooting pool or you're playing basketball, odds are you've taken a shot and you haven't had the desired effect, right? You're not shooting 100%, you don't always hit the bullseye, right? You don't run the table every time you play pool, right? Or you don't bowl a 300 every single time you step up to the lanes, right? That doesn't mean that you were irrational, right? You tried your best to do it. You just made a mistake. And so you're still rational even when you make mistakes, but the point is that you never intentionally make a mistake. The second part of this is thinking at the margin. Okay? And what the margin is talking about is basically the next unit. We never really consider consuming all of the good at once or none of the good, right? We consider each additional unit, right? So you can think about this as saying, how many hours a day should you study, right? The decision for studying is not one of, never study at all or study 24 hours a day, right? You're capable of stopping studying at some point, right? Maybe after an hour, maybe after 2 hours, right? But you can stop. Or if you think about when you eat food, right? When you have dinner, it's not the case that once you start eating, you never stop, right? You eat until the value of the next bite is equal to the cost of that next bite. And so what we're thinking about here is each additional unit that we decide to purchase or sell, right? We can think about the marginal employee, right? So businesses will hire new employees up until the last employee that they hire brings in exactly as much revenue as they cost, right? And these are things that we'll be going into more in the semester or perhaps even in subsequent classes. But the idea is that economists are constantly thinking at the margin. We're not just thinking about having, all the water in the world, for example, or no water. We're thinking about each additional glass of water that we get. Okay, so the fourth principle is that people respond to incentives. Okay, and so this is perhaps one of my favorite lessons in economics. And the idea here is, as it says, people respond to incentives. And you can think of incentives as either a cost or a benefit that is felt for a particular action. For example, if I were to pay you $10 for every class that you attended, I'm willing to bet that each and every one of you would be in class every single day, right? Or at the very least, you'd attend more classes. Or if you think about the opposite case, if I were to penalize you by $10 every time you didn't come to class, then you would likely attend class more often, right? It's the reason why we give extra credit for certain things, right? One thought behind extra credit is that we're trying to get you to do more work, or we're trying to make it possible for you to recover from a bad grade, perhaps. But another reason that we give extra credit for things is that we want you to come attend them. So I'm sure several of you have gotten extra credit over your college careers for attending some talk. That's an incentive. We can also think about incentives in the case of the law, right? So we have harsh penalties in the U.S. if you don't wear your seatbelt while you're driving. So if you get caught, there's a big ticket that you get, and so as a result, people are more likely to wear their seatbelts. Right? If we were to raise the penalty even higher, there would be a greater incentive to always wear your seatbelt, and we should expect to see fewer people not wearing their seatbelts, or more people wearing their seatbelts more often. Okay? So people respond to incentives. The fifth principle is another one of my favorites, and that one is that trade makes everyone better off. And so what this is saying is that When people exchange goods with one another, when we exchange things or we buy things or anything like that, both parties are necessarily made better off. And if you think about it, it actually kind of makes a little bit of sense. So think about in the context of any time you've ever purchased something. I'm willing to bet that after the cashier or the clerk gave you the good, after you paid for it, you said to them, thank you, right? And the reason why you said thank you is because you prefer the things that you're buying to the things that you're spending, the dollars, right? You would rather have that good than have the dollars that you currently own. And so you sacrifice the dollars and get back, the groceries or the movie tickets or whatever it is that you've purchased. At the same time, the store would rather have the dollars than the goods. And so when you say thank you to them, most of the time, if you pay attention, you'll hear them say thank you in return, right? And so this leads to what some of us like to call the double thank you. Okay? The double thank you occurs because both sides have been made better off. Another way to think of this is that trade is mutually beneficial. Right? And this is a lesson that we will be coming back to next week when we talk more in depth about trade and what it means. The sixth principle is that markets are usually a good way of organizing economic activity. And so what we're talking about here is that there's a lot of things that have to be coordinated in our daily lives. If you think about just all the sheer complexity of what's going on, or if you watch the iPencil video, or even better, read the iPencil essay that I've linked to in Blackboard, think about the millions and millions of people involved in just making a simple pencil. Now, think about how complex the decisions, the network of decisions that leads to New York City being fed, or Paris having enough food to eat, or even just your daily commute. Think of all the individual things that must be decided. And then once you recognize that no single person is in charge of them, the idea that anything in this world even exists sort of becomes absurd. It seems ridiculous that we should expect anything in the world to work when no one seems to be in charge of it. And yet the idea, which we're going to be exploring throughout this semester, is that markets actually accomplish them, and they accomplish them very well in most cases. Now, there may or may not be exceptions to this statement, but what we need to do is understand what this whole markets thing is before we start trying to improve upon it. And so what this class will be doing is talking to you about how the market operates for the first 12 weeks. And then the last 4 weeks, we'll talk about some other things, maybe some improvements or some policies that might work to make things better. The seventh principle, which relates to this, is basically, we can say it's a continuation, but sometimes government can improve things. So, when we start with the idea that markets are usually a good way of organizing economic activity, what we can then lead into, once we've understood how markets work, we can then start thinking about what cases can government improve upon the outcome of the market. And so what we're going to develop is a framework for thinking about how the world is, why or how certain things operate, and what we can do to improve upon them. So maybe there are situations which we call market failures, right? Maybe there are things that we call externalities, or maybe there are situations of market power that need to be rectified, right? And these are all potential cases, and they're not all the potential cases, but each one of these is a potential case where we could possibly improve upon the market outcome using some government policy. And so we'll explore what these things are this semester. We'll talk about them, and we'll talk about the outcomes of times where government has tried to improve them. Did it work, right? We'll ask the questions. We'll ask the difficult question of, did this actually accomplish its goal? And then we'll look at it empirically. The eighth principle is that a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce. So the basic idea here is that if a country is incapable of producing anything of value, then they won't be able to trade with one another, with other countries. They won't be able to have any sort of a standard of living, right? If you can't produce anything, then odds are you won't have anything, both because you can't make it and because you won't be able to trade with others who could. But what matters in this lesson or this principle isn't necessarily the amount of stuff that is produced, but rather how productive each individual worker actually is. And so if we look at the average salaries of people around the world, we could see that Americans earn on average about $48,000 per year. The average salary for a person in China is about $5,000, right? And so we might ask a question, well, why, right? Well, it turns out that the average American worker is much, much more productive than the average Chinese worker. This isn't true in all particular cases, but it's very true on average for a variety of reasons. What's curious about this, though, is that a Chinese immigrant to the United States typically earns something about $36,000 to $38,000 per year. So the physical act of moving someone from one geographic location to a different one tends to raise their productivity. And so we might be wondering, why is that the case? We'll talk a lot about that one later on in the semester when we get to international trade. The ninth principle is that prices tend to rise when central banks print too much money. And the idea here is that we're talking about inflation. And so when the central bank prints too much money, there becomes too much money, or too many dollars in the case of the United States, for the amount of goods that there are at those current price levels. And so what has to happen is the prices in terms of dollars have to rise to match the new supply of dollars. So for example, suppose that tomorrow morning you wake up and you find that your savings account has tripled, right? There are now 3 times as many dollars in your bank account as there were, today, right? And because, you're obviously responsible adults, you check your bank statement every morning when you wake up, very first thing. And so when you look at it, you see 3 times as many dollars, and of course, you're going to call the bank and make sure that there hasn't been a mistake. But let's suppose that, you call them and you try to explain, hey, there's more money in my account than I remember. Can you look into this? And let's say your bank tells you, nope, there hasn't been a single mistake. We have just decided to triple the number of dollars in your bank account, right? And so you would probably feel very excited, right? But let's suppose that that happens with every person in the entire country, right? If that were the case, then everyone would be just as excited and they'd be running out to buy products that they thought that they couldn't afford, right? Maybe you go buy that new video game, or you buy, a bunch of fancy smart light bulbs that change colors, or a new watch, right? Or maybe you buy a new car, right? Or at least you go out to the store to buy these things. And if you were to do that, you would find that all the prices had tripled as well. So we've tripled the number of dollars that you have, but we've also tripled the prices. And so you'd be back at square one, where you had effectively just as many real dollars as you did before. Okay, so the idea here is that if central banks print too much money too quickly, the price level will tend to rise. But this is another thing that we will spend lots of time on this semester. But what I want to do is get this into your heads now so you can start thinking about it a little bit. And then the final principle is that society faces a trade-off. So there's that word trade-off again. Between short-run unemployment and long-run inflation. And so what this is saying is that if the central bank prints money and floods the economy with cash, the prices aren't going to rise instantly, but instead will take some time to rise. And so here what we're saying is that in the short run, this will boost employment figures and reduce unemployment as people run out to spend their new money. But in the long run, inflation will catch up, and so what will happen is the unemployment rate will rise back up to where it was, as people realize that it's really just inflation that's going on. And so here the idea is that central banks can spur short-run economic activity by printing money and flooding the economy with cash, but they cannot promote long-run economic activity without causing inflation. Okay? And so these are sort of the 10 principles that we'll be exploring throughout this entire semester. But what I want to do is sort of give you sort of some perspective on them now so that you can start thinking about them. Okay? So this is, in short, a quick and short version of the entire semester condensed down into about 10 sentences. But stay tuned for future videos and future lessons where we'll go into each of these in more detail.